Hi, I'm Craig. This is a quiet, reflective read of a piece of fiction, looking at it through trauma, character, and archetype, instead of trivia or theory. Take it at whatever pace works for you.
Good morning and happy Wednesday. If you're new, thanks for joining us. We're about to read Chapter 7, The Boggart in the Wardrobe, from Harry Potter Book 3. Just a little recap on what's been happening. Chapter 5, we met the Dementor. Harry and Jenny were both really stressed out with that. And in Chapter 6, all our tension got ratcheted a notch higher in both our divination class and in our monsters class. So that's the scene heading into Chapter 7, The Boggart and the Wardrobe. Good morning. Malfoy didn't reappear in classes until late on Thursday morning, when the Slytherins and Gryffindors were halfway through double potions. He swaggered into the dungeon, his right arm covered in bandages and bound up in his sling, acting, in Harry's opinion, as though he were the heroic survivor of some dreadful battle. Okay, so I'm not going to defend Draco. He's not a nice kid. However, a little empathy might help. If not to forgive him, at least to understand him allows you to better defeat him. How is it, Draco? Simpered Pansy Parkinson. Does it hurt much? Yeah, said Malfoy, putting on a brave sort of grimace. But Harry saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle when Pansy had looked away. Settle down, said Professor Snape idly. Harry and Ron scowled at each other. Snape wouldn't have said settle down if they'd walked in late. He'd have given them detention. But Malfoy had always been able to get away with anything in Snape's classes. Snape was head of Slytherin House and generally favored his own students above all others. That is toxic in an organization. That is a problem that Hogwarts needs to solve, because that sort of thing just rots an organization from the inside. They were making a new potion today, a shrinking solution. Malfoy set up his cauldron right next to Harry and Ron so that they were preparing their ingredients on the same table. Sir, Malfoy called, Sir, I'll need help cutting up these daisy roots because of my arm. Weasley, cut up Malfoy's roots for him, said Snape without looking up. No, it isn't empathy. No, it isn't easy. No, not at all. Ron went brick red. There's nothing wrong with your arm, he hissed at Malfoy. Malfoy smirked across the table. Weasley, you heard Professor Snape. Cut up these roots. Ron seized his knife, pulled Malfoy's roots toward him, and began to chop them roughly so that they were all different sizes. Just because you have empathy doesn't mean you have to allow them to behave badly or treat anybody else badly. Empathy doesn't equal permission. Professor, drawled Malfoy, Weasley's mutilating my roots, sir. Snape approached their table, stared down his hooked nose at the roots, then gave Ron an unpleasant smile from beneath his long, greasy black hair. Change roots with Malfoy, Weasley. But, sir, Ron had spent the last quarter of an hour carefully shredding his own roots into exactly equal pieces. Okay, see, now Malfoy is stealing Ron's work. He's basically sort of made Ron a little miniature slave. Now, said Snape in his most dangerous voice. Ron shoved his own beautifully cut roots across the table at Malfoy, then took up the knife again. And, sir, I'll need this shrivel fig skinned, said Malfoy, his voice full of malicious laughter. Yeah, no, you can't really defend Malfoy's choices. Potter, you can skin Malfoy's shrivel fig, said Snape, giving Harry the look of loathing he always reserved just for him. Harry took Malfoy's shrivel fig as Ron began trying to repair the damage to the roots he now had to use. Harry skinned the shrivel fig as fast as he could and flung it back across the table at Malfoy without speaking. Malfoy was smirking more broadly than ever. Seen your pal Hagrid lately? He asked them quietly. None of your business, said Ron jerkily without looking up. I'm afraid he won't be a teacher much longer, said Malfoy in a tone of mock sorrow. Father's not very happy about my injury. Keep talking, Malfoy, and I'll give you a real injury, snarled Ron. He's complained to the school governors and to the Ministry of Magic. Father's got a lot of influence, you know. And a lasting injury like this? He gave a huge, fake sigh. Who knows if my arm will ever be the same again? So that's why you're putting it on, said Harry, accidentally beheading a dead caterpillar because his hand was shaking in anger. Oof. All the physical symptoms that this kid keeps expressing. To try and get Hagrid fired. Well, said Malfoy, lowering his voice to a whisper, partly, Potter, but there are other benefits too. Weasley, slice my caterpillars for me. A few cauldrons away, Neville was in trouble. Well, of course he was. Poor Neville. Neville regularly went to pieces in potions lessons. It was his worst subject, and his great fear of Professor Snape made things 10 times worse. Well, he's a clearly anxious kid, and the teacher stresses him out. His potion, which was supposed to be a bright acid green, had turned orange, Longbottom, said Snape, ladling some up and allowing it to splash back into the cauldron so that everyone could see, making sure it's properly embarrassed. Orange, tell me, boy, does anything penetrate that thick skull of yours? Didn't you hear me say quite clearly that only one rat spleen was needed? Didn't I state plainly that a dash of leech juice would suffice? What do I have to do to make you understand, Longbottom? Oof, that kind of critical public shaming is just ruthless, man. Neville was pink and trembling. He looked as though he was on the verge of tears, because he was. He really does use the worst sort of teaching methods. If the Dursleys are the worst sort of muggles, he is the worst sort of teacher. Neville was pink and trembling. He looked as though he was on the verge of tears. Please, sir, said Hermione, please. I could help Neville put it right. I don't remember asking you to show off, Miss Granger, said Snape coldly. And Hermione went as pink as Neville. Yeah, he's just shutting everybody down. Longbottom, at the end of this lesson, we will feed a few drops of this potion to your toad and see what happens. Perhaps that will encourage you to do it properly. Snape moved away, leaving Neville breathless with fear. I mean, we already know this far along that Neville's already put a lot of time and energy and emotional investment in taking care of this toad. He cares. Help me, he moaned to Hermione. Hey, Harry, said Seamus Finnegan, leaning over to borrow Harry's brass scales. Have you heard, Daily Prophet, this morning? They reckon Sirius Black's been sighted. Where? Said Harry and Ron quickly. On the other side of the table, Malfoy looked up, listening closely. Not too far from here, said Seamus, who looked excited. It was a muggle who saw him. Of course, she didn't really understand. The muggles think he's just an ordinary criminal, don't they? So she phoned the telephone hotline. By the time the Ministry of Magic got there, he was gone. Not too far from here, Ron repeated, looking significantly at Harry. He turned around and saw Malfoy watching closely. What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned? But Malfoy's eyes were shining malevolently, and they were fixed on Harry. He leaned across the table. Thinking of trying to catch Black, single-handed, Potter? Yeah, that's right, said Harry offhandedly. Malfoy's thin mouth was curving in a mean smile. Of course, if it was me, he said quietly, I'd have done something before now. I wouldn't be staying in school like a good boy. I'd be out there looking for him. What are you talking about, Malfoy? Said Ron roughly. Don't you know, Potter? Breathed Malfoy. His pale eyes narrowed. Yeah, his pale eyes are narrowed because he's now scanning for expressions. He's about to provoke something and he wants to see how it hits. That makes a lot of sense. I didn't understand why he cared. I just knew that he did. Know what? Malfoy let out a low, sneering laugh. Maybe you'd rather not risk your neck, he said. Want to leave it to the Dementors, do you? But if it was me, I'd want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself. What are you talking about? Said Harry angrily. But at that moment, Snape called. You should have finished adding your ingredients by now. This potion needs to stew before it can be drunk, so clear away while it simmers, and we'll test Longbottom's. Crab and Goyle laughed openly. Watch Neville sweat. He's standing there and he's sweating. This is not good. As he stirred his potion feverishly, Hermione was muttering instructions to him out of the corner of her mouth so that Snape wouldn't see. Harry and Ron packed away their unused ingredients and went to wash their hands and ladles in the stone basin in the corner. What did Malfoy mean? Harry muttered to Ron as he stuck his hands under the icy jet that poured from the gargoyle's mouth. I mean, nothing wrong with that interpretation. Could be true. Yeah, that thing is always trying to get away, but it's a toad. They jump. It's like the one thing it does. Goes, does the tongue thing and it jumps. Doesn't have a whole lot of options. Why would I want revenge on Black? He hasn't done anything to me yet. He's making it up, said Ron savagely. He's trying to make you do something stupid. The end of the lesson in sight, Snape strode over to Neville, who was cowering by his cauldron. By the way, good catch by Ron. That's what it is. It might have an element of truth, but the intent is simply to provoke. Everyone gather round, said Snape, his black eyes glittering, and watch what happens to Longbottom's toad. If he has managed to produce a shrinking solution, it will shrink to a tadpole. And why would Neville want that? If, as I don't doubt, he has done it wrong, his toad is likely to be poisoned. What is the win in this situation for Neville? There is literally none. The Gryffindors watched fearfully. Oh, by the way, not only is this unfair, but it's capricious. Right? When people are afraid of like the old Greek gods who would just strike randomly, capriciously, unjustly, this is the sort of power that people were afraid of. The Gryffindors watched fearfully. The Slytherins looked excited. Yeah, they're excited to see some suffering. Snape picked up Trevor the Toad in his left hand. We renamed him. Bring up our empathy as readers. Give it a name. Snape picked up Trevor the Toad in his left hand and dipped a small spoon into Neville's potion, which was now green. He trickled a few drops down Trevor's throat. There was a moment of hushed silence in which Trevor gulped. Then there was a small pop, and Trevor the Tadpole was wriggling in Snape's palm. The Gryffindors burst into applause. Snape, looking sour, pulled a small bottle from the pocket of his robe, poured a few drops on top of Trevor, and he reappeared suddenly, fully grown. Okay. I don't know what's going on with Snape in this chapter, but he is all up in his filch. I want to punish people. Really toxic. 5 points from Gryffindor, said Snape, which wiped the smiles from every face. I told you not to help him, Miss Granger. Class dismissed. Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the steps to the entrance hall. Harry was still thinking about what Malfoy had said, while Ron was seething about Snape. 5 points from Gryffindor because the potion was all right? Why didn't you lie, Hermione? You should have said Neville did it all by himself. Hermione didn't answer. Ron looked around. Where is she? Harry turned too. They were at the top of the steps now, watching the rest of the class pass them, heading for the Great Hall and lunch. I mean, by all accounts, it's a charming little lake. Who wouldn't want to be over there? It's probably really dry in some of those classrooms. She was right behind us, said Ron, frowning. Malfoy passed them, walking between Crabbe and Goyle. He smirked at Harry and disappeared. There she is, said Harry. Hermione was panting slightly, hurrying up the stairs. One hand clutched her bag, and the other seemed to be tucking something down the front of her robes. How did you do that? Said Ron. What? Said Hermione, joining them. 1 minute you're right behind us. The next moment, you were back at the bottom of the stairs again. What? Hermione looked slightly confused. Oh, I had to go back for something. Oh no. A seam had split on Hermione's bag. Harry wasn't surprised. He could see that it was crammed with at least a dozen large and heavy books. Why are you carrying all those around with you? Ron asked her. You know how many subjects I'm taking, said Hermione breathlessly. Couldn't hold these for me, could you? But Ron was turning over the books she had handed him. Okay, those are both very valid points. Katie points out that she's probably in a bad mood because of Lupin's appointment. I didn't think about that. Yeah, that 100% makes sense. They loathe each other. And yeah, absolutely. He takes his anger out on others, weaker others. Looking at the covers, you haven't got any of those subjects today. It's only Defense Against the Dark Arts this afternoon. Oh, yes, said Hermione vaguely, but she packed all the books back into her bag just the same. I hope there's something good for lunch. I'm starving, she added, and she marched off toward the Great Hall. Do you get the feeling Hermione's not telling us something? Ron asked Harry. Professor Lupin wasn't there when they arrived at his first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson. They all sat down, took out their books, quills, and parchment, and were talking when he finally entered the room. Lupin smiled vaguely and placed his tatty old briefcase on the teacher's desk. He was as shabby as ever, but looked healthier than he had on the train, as though he had had a few square meals and probably some decent sleep. Good afternoon, he said. Would you please put all your books back in your bags? Today's will be a practical lesson. You will need only your wands. I don't remember if you were a kid, but I loved classes that started like that. A few curious looks were exchanged as the class put away their books. They had never had a practical defense against the dark arts before, unless you counted the memorable class last year when their old teacher had brought a cage full of pixies to class and set them loose. Yeah, that was extremely ill-advised, and no wonder there was no repetition of that. Right then, said Professor Lupin when everyone was ready. If you'd follow me. Puzzled but interested, the class got to its feet and followed Professor Lupin out of the classroom. See? Like that sentence right there. Puzzled but interested. Not trepidation, not fear, not apprehension. Curious. He led them along the deserted corridor and around a corner, where the first thing they saw was Peeves the poltergeist, who was floating upside down in midair and stuffing the nearest keyhole with chewing gum. Peeves didn't look up until Professor Lupin was 2 feet away. Then he wiggled his curly-toed feet and broke into song. Loony loopy Lupin, Peeves sang. Loony loopy Lupin, loony loopy Lupin. Rude and unmanageable as he almost always was, Peeves usually showed some respect toward the teachers. Everyone looked quickly at Professor Lupin to see how he would take this. Yes, they are all watching him. To their surprise, he was still smiling. I would take that gum out of the keyhole if I were you, Peeves, he said pleasantly. Mr. Filch won't be able to get into his brooms. Filch was the Hogwarts caretaker, a bad-tempered, failed wizard who waged a constant war against the students, and indeed, Peeves. However, Peeves paid no attention to Professor Lupin's words, except to blow a loud, wet raspberry. All the kids wanted to see how Lupin reacts, and he just blew their minds, because what he did was he didn't. He had some emotional containment, even though he probably was irritated as heck. He didn't react, and he didn't feed the attention monster that is Peeves. Professor Lupin gave a small sigh and took out his wand. This is a useful little spell, he told the class over his shoulder. Please watch closely. He raised the wand to shoulder height and said, Wariwasi, and pointed it at Peeves. With the force of a bullet, the wad of chewing gum shot out of the keyhole and straight down Peeves' left nostril. He whirled upright and zoomed away, cursing. Cool, sir, said Dean Thomas in amazement. Thank you, Dean, said Professor Lupin, putting his wand away again. Shall we proceed? Now that is some practical defense against the dark arts. We didn't get mad. We didn't get scary. Granted, Peeves isn't the dark arts, but he is certainly a dark figure, and we just dealt with it without being emotionally shattered. Good role modeling for the kids. Thank you, Dean, said Professor Lupin, putting his wand away again. Shall we proceed? They set off again, the class looking at shabby Professor Lupin with increased respect. He led them down a second corridor and stopped right outside the staff room door. Inside, please, said Professor Lupin, opening it and standing back. The staff room, a long paneled room full of old mismatched chairs, was empty except for one teacher. All right, now look at what we've done. Instead of exposing the kids to this risk in their classroom where they should feel safe, he has taken them somewhere else. So if anybody has any bad associations with this event, they don't have to go back to that room. Or if the room gets destroyed, they still have somewhere to have class. Either way, Professor Snape was sitting in a low armchair, and he looked around as the class filed in. His eyes were glittering, and there was a nasty sneer playing around his mouth. As Professor Lupin came in and made to close the door behind him, Snape said, "Leave it open, Lupin. I'd rather not witness this." He got to his feet and strode past the class, his black robes billowing behind him. At the doorway, he turned on his heel and said, "Possibly nobody's warned you, Lupin, but this class contains Neville Longbottom. I would advise you not to entrust him with anything difficult, not unless Miss Granger is hissing instructions in his ears." Ooh, that's... Okay. So that's meant to rile everybody up. Lupin has already started establishing a safe feeling vibe with the kids, and now Snape has just escalated the group's anxiety because everybody's paying attention to this. Everybody's hearing this. Everybody's anxiety is going up. Nobody likes this kind of conflict because who's next? Could be you. It's not that funny when you could be next. Neville went scarlet. Harry glared at Snape. It was bad enough that he bullied Neville in his own classes, let alone doing it in front of other teachers. Correct. Professor Lupin had raised his eyebrows. "I was hoping that Neville would assist me with the first stage of the operation," he said, "and I am sure he will perform it admirably." Ha! Boom. Again, emotional containment. We didn't snap back emotionally, but we did support the people that needed supporting, and we set a boundary. He said, "This is my class, and I'll run it how I want, and I'll make my own assessments." Nicely done, Lupin. Snape's lip curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. "Now then," said Professor Lupin, beckoning the class toward the end of the room, where there was nothing but an old wardrobe where the teachers kept their spare robes. As Professor Lupin went to stand next to it, the wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. "Nothing to worry about," said Professor Lupin calmly, because a few people had jumped backward in alarm. "There's a Boggart in there." Most people seemed to feel that this was something to worry about. Neville gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Boggarts, like dark, closed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes, the gaps beneath beds, the cupboards under sinks. I once met one that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in yesterday afternoon, and I asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it to give my third years some practice. So Boggarts like to settle in the same places that made us afraid of as kids, where the creepy shadows fall in the middle of the night and we are so alone. That's where the Boggarts live." So the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a Boggart? Hermione put up her hand. "It's a shapeshifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us the most. It's fear itself." "Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. All right, so her morale is getting restored. "So the Boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a Boggart looks like when he is alone, but when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears." All right, so a metaphor for fear itself, which is formless. It is nameless. It is just fear. "This means," said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, "that we have a huge advantage over the Boggart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry?" Trying to answer A question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air, was very off-putting, but Harry had to go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should be? Yeah, right? He sure did. Precisely, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a Boggart. He becomes confused. Which should he become, a headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a Boggart make that very mistake. Tried to frighten two people at once and turned himself into half a slug. Now let's think about our fears when we're really afraid and there's somebody else that we can trust and we can share our fear with. A lot of times it can become a confused and sort of not scary thing. A little extra perspective can help. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a Boggart is simple, yet it requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes a Boggart is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, said the class together. Good, said Professor Lupin. Very good. But that was the easy part, I'm afraid. You see, the word alone is not enough. And this is where you come in, Neville. This feels, for once, like the kids are actually getting adequate instruction in a task. Yeah. And what Lupin seems to be doing here, in a sense, is effectively doing a little bit of group therapy. And he's going to encourage them to work with each other or respect each other, or at least have a little empathy for each other. The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as Neville, who walked forward as though he were heading for the gallows. Clearly scared, showing all the tells. I mean, the dude's normally scared. His poor parasympathetic nervous system must be shot, this kid. Right, Neville, said Professor Lupin. First things first. What would you say is the thing that frightens you most in the world? Neville's lips moved, but no noise came out. 'Cause he's that scared. Didn't catch that, Neville. Sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully, not scornfully, cheerfully. Neville looked around rather wildly. Yeah, crazy eyes. You ever see somebody in a panic with darting eyes? Dude's having crazy eyes. As though begging someone to help him, and then said in barely more than a whisper, Professor Snape. Nearly everyone laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. Again, not scorning. Professor Snape. Neville, I believe you live with your grandmother. Okay, this is Lupin's like actually doing a little therapy here. Yes, said Neville nervously, but I don't want the Boggart to turn into her either. No, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling, reassuring and calming. I wonder, could you tell us what sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville looked startled, but said, well, always the same hat, a tall one with a stuffed vulture on top, and a long dress, green normally, and sometimes a fox fur scarf. And a handbag? Prompted Professor Lupin. It's collaborative. A big red one, said Neville. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Neville? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that this is a way that you should do it, but it's certainly a far better lesson, not only in the subject matter, but in emotional containment and self-regulation than they've had so far. It might be flawed, but for a guy who's not supposed to be teaching that, he's doing a great job. So yeah, might be a little problematic there. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Neville? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yes, said Neville uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. Uncertainty and wondering is less scared than he was just a little while ago. He's already less afraid. Ah, good job, Lupin. When the Boggart bursts out of this wardrobe, Neville, and sees you, it will assume the form of Professor Snape, said Lupin, and you will raise your wand thus and cry, "Ridiculous!" and concentrate hard on your grandmother's clothes. If all goes well, Professor Boggart Snape will be forced into that vulture-topped hat and that green dress with that big red handbag. There was a great shout of laughter. But this time, the kids aren't laughing at Neville. There was a great shout of laughter. The wardrobe wobbled more violently. If Neville is successful, the Boggart is likely to shift his attention to each of us in turn, said Lupin, because fear is always looking for a home. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you the most and imagine how you might force it to look comical. All right, so even before we've started, we're getting everybody involved. We've already seen how this downregulated Neville. Now we're bringing everybody down a little bit, and they're prepared. Nice. Good teaching. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Because one of them is collaborative and sensitive, and the other one is dictatorial and authoritarian. Very different teaching styles. The room went quiet. Harry thought, what scared him most in the world? His first thought was Lord Voldemort. A Voldemort returned to full strength. But before he had even started to plan a possible counterattack on a Boggart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hand slithering back beneath a black cloak. A long rattling breath from an unseen mouth, then a cold so penetrating it felt like drowning. If the Dementor could also represent a panic attack, which is, triggered by some really core trauma, that would make sense that this is Harry's biggest fear. Harry shivered, then looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Ron was muttering to himself, "Take its legs off. Take its legs off." Harry was sure he knew what that was about. Ron's greatest fear was spiders. "Everyone ready?" said Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of fear. He wasn't ready. How could you make a Dementor less frightening? But he didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone else was nodding and rolled up their sleeves. "Neville, we're going to back away," said Professor Lupin. "Let you have a clear field, all right? I'll call the next person forward. Everyone back now, so Neville can get a clear shot." They all retreated, backed against the walls, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe. He looked pale and frightened, but he had pushed up the sleeves of his robe and was holding his wand ready. All right, he's not being forced. He is engaging with this task. "On the count of 3, Neville," said Professor Lupin, who was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3, now. A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Neville. Neville backed away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly. Snape was bearing down on him, reaching inside his robes. "Ridiculous!" squeaked Neville. There was a noise like a whip crack. Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long, lace-trimmed dress and a towering hat topped with a moth-eaten vulture, and he was swinging a huge crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter. The Boggart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, "Parvati, forward!" Parvati walked forward, her face set. Snape rounded on her. There was another crack, and where he had stood was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face turned to Parvati, and it began to walk toward her very slowly, dragging its feet, its stiff arms rising. What an excellent point. Also, some of them are very definitely irrational fears. It's probably wise to be a little wary of Snape since he just got done humiliating Neville. I don't know what's going on in the wizarding world, but normally mummies aren't a generally large concern. It's an interesting thought, though. A bandage unraveled at the mummy's feet. It became entangled. Its face fell forward, and its head rolled off. Seamus! Roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted past Parvati. Crack. Where the mummy had been was a woman with floor-length black hair and a skeletal green-tinged face. A banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room. A long, wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. Ridiculous! Shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack. The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle, then crack, became a rattlesnake, which slithered and writhed before crack, became a single bloody eyeball. Well, that's kind of gross. Great question. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know. Crack, becoming a single bloody eyeball. It's confused, shouted Lupin. We're getting there, Dean. Dean hurried forward. Crack. The eyeball became a severed hand, which flipped over and began to creep along the floor like a crab. Okay, that's gross. Ridiculous, yelled Dean. There was a snap, and the hand was trapped in a mousetrap. Excellent. Ron, you next. Ron leapt forward. Crack. Quite a few people screamed. A giant spider, 6 feet tall and covered in hair, was advancing on Ron, clicking its pincers menacingly. For a second, Harry thought Ron had frozen. Then, ridiculous, bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished. It rolled over and over. Lavender Brown squealed and ran out of its way, and it came to a halt at Harry's feet. He raised his wand, ready, but... Okay, I like what Ron did there. It feels like many of the kids are either not truly afraid of something or they summoned something they felt they could still handle. Ron actually summoned something so scary that the other kids were scared. And instead of reacting instantly, he braced himself and he sat in that feeling for an actual moment. And then he chose to act. Ron did some powerful self-exposure therapy right there. So good job, Ron. Here, shouted Professor Lupin suddenly, hurrying forward. Crack. The legless spider had vanished. For a second, everyone looked wildly to see where it was. Then they saw a silvery white orb hanging in the air in front of Lupin, who said, Ridiculous! Almost lazily. Crack. Ah, nice. Ending where we began. Forward, Neville, and finish him off, said Lupin as the Boggart landed on the floor as a cockroach. Crack. Snape was back. This time, Neville charged forward, looking determined. Ridiculous, he shouted, and they had a split-second's view of Snape in his lacy dress before Neville let out a great ha of laughter, and the Boggart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and was gone. At least for the moment in that room, they have banished their fear. As a group. Nicely done, right? Excellent, cried Professor Lupin as the class broke into applause. Excellent, Neville. Well done, everyone. Let me see. 5 points to Gryffindor for every person to tackle the Boggart. 10 for Neville because he did it twice. And 5 each to Hermione and Harry. But I didn't do anything, said Harry. You and Hermione answered my questions correctly at the start of the class, Harry, Lupin said lightly. Very well, everyone. An excellent lesson. Homework. Kindly read the chapter on Boggarts and summarize it for me, to be handed in on Monday. That will be all. Talking excitedly, the class left the staff room. Harry, however, wasn't feeling cheerful. Let's examine this here in a minute. Professor Lupin had deliberately stopped him from tackling the Boggart. Why? Was it because he'd seen Harry collapse on the train? Yes. And thought he wasn't up to much? Not quite. Had he thought Harry would pass out again? Possibly. But no one seemed to have noticed anything. Did you see me take that banshee? Shouted Seamus. And the hand, said Dean, waving his own around. And Snape in that hat. And my mummy. I wonder why Professor Lupin's frightened of crystal balls, said Lavender thoughtfully. Well, what else might look like a crystal ball? I don't know. That was the best defense against the dark arts lesson we've ever had, wasn't it? Said Ron excitedly as they made their way back to the classroom to get their bags. All this ranting and raving, they're reinforcing with validation the behaviors that just made them feel good. He seems like a very good teacher, said Hermione approvingly, but I wish I could have had a turn with the Boggart. What would it have been for you? Said Ron, sniggering. A piece of homework that only got 9 out of 10? I think Lupin didn't have Harry participate because Harry is too dysregulated to confront his fears in this moment. He still needs to heal a bit from his last exposure. But of course, already having some shame about this whole thing, Harry's going to be hyper vigilant to anything that could possibly make him feel ashamed of it. Anyways, chapter 5 brought in some tension. Chapter 6 ratcheted it up. Chapter 7 up a little bit more. And then Professor Lupin brought us all back down again. So I really enjoyed that chapter. How do you make a fear of fear into a shape? I guess you just have to project it into something that you could visualize. It's a really interesting question, though, you two. But that brings us to the end of chapter 7. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time for the Flight of the Fat Lady. Have a great day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.